2,000 years ago, Jesus endured the most famous punishment of all time. Roman soldiers drove nails through his hands and feet and raised him on a wooden cross. A slow, public way to go, and a chilling message to Rome's enemies. But for nearly 2,000 years, people didn't blame the Romans for the crucifixion of Jesus. They blamed the Jews. It's an accusation that's echoed throughout history, from sermons to plays to Hollywood movies. Over the centuries, it evolved into something even darker: the belief that all Jews, past and present, are guilty of murdering the person that they believe is the Son of God, an idea that's haunted Jewish history for generations. So why are Jews blamed for the crucifixion of Jesus? Before we can investigate who's responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus, we need to go back to the world where Jesus lived, a land under foreign rule simmering with tension. The scene was ancient Judea, a province under the rule of the Roman Empire. The local Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, called the shots. He collected taxes, commanded soldiers, and decided who lived and who stopped living. The local Judean leaders kept their power as long as they kept the peace and the money flowing. Any threat to Roman rule could upend the fragile balance of power and unleash the empire's iron fist on the whole land. Now, all of this territory used to be part of the kingdom of Herod the Great, a Jewish king who ruled under the heavy influence of Rome. But after he passed away, Rome divided his kingdom among his 3 sons. One ruled this area, one ruled Galilee, where Jesus grew up, and one ruled this territory known as Judea. But he turned out to be brutal and incompetent. He was such a disaster that the Romans removed him from power, annexed his territories directly into the Roman Empire, and sent its own governors to run the province directly. In other words, while the other 2 regions had Jewish rulers under Roman oversight, Judea was now under direct Roman rule.
After Herod's son was fired from the job of being the ruler of Judea, he was in effect replaced by the Roman prefect, and Pontius Pilate would be one of those prefects. And Pilate would have been in control of 3,000 Roman troops. They would have been stationed mostly in Caesarea on the coast, and they would have come up to Jerusalem at least 3 times a year to help with policing the pilgrim crowds to make sure things were quiet and things ran on time.
The political and economic heart of Judea was the Jewish Holy Temple, controlled by the temple priests.
The temple was the beating heart of Jewish peoplehood. It had a reputation of being one of the most beautiful temples in the world, and it was built to accommodate a huge number of people. The temple was a site of sacrifice, usually pigeons, which were available in the temple courtyard, but there are also offerings of oil and wheat. It's not always an animal sacrifice that's offered at the temple.
Now, the Romans had zero patience for disorder. If they sensed rebellion brewing, they crushed it with devastating efficiency. And in those years, rebellion often took the form of prophetic figures, men who claimed divine authority, promising freedom or revelation. Some gathered small followings. Others drew huge crowds. Rome crushed them all. One story, recorded by the ancient historian Josephus, tells of a Samaritan prophet who promised to reveal sacred treasures supposedly buried by Moses at the top of a mountain. He led a mass of followers to climb it, but the Roman governor sent in troops before they even began the ascent. The soldiers slaughtered many of the followers, and Pilate had the movement's leaders executed. That is how Rome kept order: swift, ruthless, and public. To them, any prophet who attracted a crowd was a potential threat. And for the temple priests, the stakes were enormous: keep the peace or invoke the wrath of Rome. And then, along came Jesus of Nazareth. Now, for millions of Christians, this is a story of faith. But like all sacred texts, from the Torah to the Bhagavad Gita, the Gospels were written at particular moments for particular audiences, shaped by the events surrounding them. Understanding that historical context can help explain how these stories took shape and how they were later understood. According to the Christian Gospels written decades after the crucifixion, Jesus was a prophetic Jewish figure with an apocalyptic message about the coming kingdom of God. He was also a charismatic teacher who preached compassion, humility, and justice.
Jesus lived in Galilee according to the 4 canonical Gospels, but he wandered around in different villages. He walked through Samaria to get to Judea, and he also taught in Jerusalem. It's natural for Jesus to be in Jerusalem at Passover because he's interested in reaching as many Jews as possible with his message about the impending kingdom of God. And he was celebrated as he came into the city by pilgrim crowds. And he was teaching at the Temple Mount in the days leading up to the Passover feast. So he's getting more and more crowds, more and more excited with this apocalyptic message that the kingdom of God is at hand. Rome doesn't like excited, popular crowds.
According to the Gospels, Jesus also condemned the temple's financial practices, accusing its priests of exploiting the poor.
There's a story about Jesus going into the temple complex just before Passover and overturning the tables of the money changers and driving away the pigeon sellers. And there was an exchange of coins because the temple accepted as donations the Tyrian shekel, which had a very stable silver content. But different cities in antiquity minted their own coins. So people coming from other locations would exchange their money for the Tyrian shekel so that they could make the donation to the temple. Those are the tables that Jesus was said to have overturned. And in the gospel stories, it comes off like an economic critique of the temple.
It almost sounds like the Occupy Wall Street of its time, challenging the temple economy. In the Gospels, Jesus famously accused the priests of turning a house of prayer to a den of robbers. It was the kind of protest Rome wouldn't tolerate, and the temple priests couldn't afford. According to the Gospels, Jesus was arrested and handed over to the Roman governor. But exactly who did the arresting is a point of conflict among the Gospels.
It's hard to know what actually happened during the run-up to the crucifixion. Jesus was obviously arrested, but it has two different agents depending on which gospel you look at. According to Mark, it was a Jewish mob who went out to arrest Jesus. According to John, I think more plausibly, it's a mix of temple police and Roman soldiers.
Regardless of who did the arresting, the Gospels agree that after Jesus was turned over to the Romans, Pontius Pilate sentenced him to crucifixion.
In the period of Jesus' lifetime, the only power that had the authority to order a crucifixion was Roman power. Only Pilate could have stood behind the order to crucify.
But even though Rome brought the charges and carried out the execution, here's where things take a surprising turn.
According to the Gospels, Pilate is a tremendously sympathetic figure. He really doesn't want to hurt Jesus at all. He's forced to do it by the priests and the hostile mob.
In the Gospel of Mark, Pilate offers to release Jesus and asks the Jewish crowd, "What evil has he done?" But the crowd shouts, "Crucify him." In Luke, Pilate insists that Jesus doesn't deserve to be crucified. In John, the Jewish leaders even threaten Pilate if he releases Jesus. The pattern is clear. Pilate is hesitant, maybe even noble, backed into a corner, while merciless Jews demand punishment. But how does this fit with the other historical information we have on Pilate?
Luckily for us, we have reports about Pilate elsewhere in Philo of Alexandria and also in Josephus. Philo mentions that Pilate was legendarily corrupt and violent, and particularly known for his murder of untried prisoners. And Josephus talks about Pilate had kind of a lead foot when it came to diplomacy, and he used temple funds to build an aqueduct. There's a riot against him for doing that, and he ends up causing the deaths of some of the rioters by dispersing soldiers among the crowd.
So according to other historical accounts, Pilate was ruthless, decisive, and not at all squeamish about using force, like in the story of the Samaritan prophet, which also appeared in Josephus.
The depiction of Pilate in Philo and Josephus seems more plausible to me than the depiction of Pilate in the Gospels.
Dr. Friedrichsen also questions the idea that an angry crowd of Jews called for Jesus' crucifixion.
Jesus is so popular that the high priests in chapter 14 of Mark say that they're going to arrest Jesus, but they're going to do it secretly, lest there be a tumult among the people. So that's a gauge of how popular Jesus is with the pilgrim crowd. So where does this hostile mob come from? It's just not explained at all.
Let's assume Dr. Friedrichsen is right, that Pilate wasn't gentle and the crowds weren't raging against Jesus. But that raises a huge question. Why would the Gospels de-emphasize Pilate and instead emphasize the Jews? Some people suggest that the men writing the Gospels decades after the crucifixion had a strong incentive to stay on Rome's good side, to make sure that early Christianity wasn't seen as a threat to the empire. It sounds plausible, but Dr. Friedrichsen doesn't actually find this explanation convincing.
I mean, nobody's reading these Gospels. If Rome was busy reading all of the religious documents that people were writing in this period, they would have hardly had time to have a battle. I don't think the Gospel writers are worried that Rome is going to yell at them because they have a crucified Messiah.
So if that's not the reason, then what could possibly explain the focus on Jewish responsibility and not Roman responsibility? According to Dr. Friedrichsen, it helps to think of the early Christian writers as Jews themselves, since they came out of the Jewish world.
I think the Gospel writers are Jews themselves, and I think that it's an internal dynamic that's going on with how do you account for the destruction of the temple. I think that the stories that inculpate Jews and inculpate the priests and exculpate Pilate are trying to explain internally why God allows his temple to be destroyed, because the temple is particularly the seat of the priests. It's really an internal Jewish discussion that's going on of why the temple is destroyed.
In other words, Jews at the time were prone to self-reflection. It's a very Jewish thing to view tragedies and disasters through a lens of questioning what we did to cause God to allow this to happen to us. After the destruction of the first temple, Jewish prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel didn't blame the Babylonians. They blamed it on Jewish sin, idolatry, injustice, and hypocrisy. When the second temple was destroyed, the emerging leaders of rabbinic Judaism didn't blame the Romans. They blamed baseless hatred among Jews themselves. The Christian Gospels were also written after the destruction of the second temple, so perhaps it's not surprising that Jesus' disciples, who were products of the same Jewish tradition of self-reflection, didn't blame the Romans either. They blamed the financial practices of the temple priests and their refusal to accept Jesus, which is all perfectly dramatized in their version of the crucifixion story. Think about it. From their perspective, the temple leaders who played a role in the arrest of Jesus were Jews. So in that sense, of course the Gospels lay some blame on the Jews. But remember who else was Jewish at the time? Jesus and his disciples. Which is why it feels weird to interpret the Gospels as a story that blames the Jews, instead of a story about internal Jewish debate critical of some Jewish leaders. But it's one thing to blame Jewish leaders who lived during the time of Jesus. It's another thing completely to blame all Jews, even those who weren't alive at the time. So, how did this grow into a collective charge that all Jews for all time were guilty of killing Jesus? The answer ties back to the interpretation of one line in the Gospels. In Matthew 27, Pilate tries to convince the Jewish crowd to let Jesus go, but they refuse. So he literally washes his hands of guilt and says, "I am innocent of this man's blood." And the crowd responds with, "His blood be on us and on our children." Those 4 words turned this into one of the most tragic verses in Christian Jewish history, because some later Christians used it as theological justification for the collective guilt of all Jews. So why did Matthew include this line in his version?
What modern readers don't appreciate is that Matthew was basically predicting the past, because it was Jesus' generation and the following generation that would have been cut down by Rome. It's a prophecy that already happened.
In other words, Matthew was writing after the Romans had already crushed the Jewish revolt and destroyed the temple, a catastrophe that devastated Jesus' generation and their children. So Dr. Friedrichsen believes that when Matthew wrote, "on us and our children," he's not cursing all future Jews forever. He's pointing to a tragedy his audience had already lived through. The karmic debt had already been paid. But in later years, many Christian readers misunderstood that line, ripped it from its original context, and weaponized it to blame every Jew for Jesus' death. To make matters worse, the Gospels repeatedly describe Jesus' opponents as the Jews. But in the original Greek, the word was Judaioi, literally Judeans, meaning people from the province around Jerusalem.
The word Judaioi can be translated both as Jews and Judeans. In the context of the gospel narratives, it's the people who are in Judea, in Jerusalem, who are the engines of the narratives. Once you take it out of that context and you look at the word to mean Jews, meaning the Jew who lives next door to you in the city and the diaspora you're living in, it ends up spreading the indictment to an entire population. Again, if you think of the gospel writers as themselves Jewish, you can see the stories as this internal critique, but these stories circulate eventually to a changed ethnic audience. And what is an inner Jewish critique swells into becoming an anti-Jewish critique.
Over time, particular interpretations of the Gospels worked its way into liturgy, plays, and sermons, inciting countless attacks against Jews throughout history. For centuries, the story of Jesus' crucifixion was retold in ways that turned faith into a weapon, demonizing Jews for murdering Jesus and sparking riots against local Jewish communities. During the Crusades, armies marching to the Holy Land destroyed Jewish communities on the way to avenge Jesus. Jewish guilt for crucifying Jesus helped justify the Spanish expulsion of Jews. Even the Third Reich drew on these same themes, publishing illustrations of Jews mocking the crucifixion as part of its broader incitement. After nearly 2,000 years, the Catholic Church finally confronted this distortion and said what should have been obvious all along. It issued a declaration stating that the crucifixion of Jesus cannot be charged against all the Jews without distinction, then alive, nor against the Jews of today. In other words, don't blame all the Jews in ancient Judea for the action of a few temple leaders, and definitely don't blame all Jews alive today for something that's literally ancient history. It was a vital correction, but reversing nearly 2 millennia of hatred can't happen with a single statement, because the myth is still alive. People still blame the Jews, still portray them as cursed or evil. Like glowing embers that refuse to quit, these old ideas keep finding new ways to burn, and it takes very little to fan the flames. Like in Mel Gibson's famous movie about the crucifixion. It was controversial because of how Gibson chose to exaggerate the role of Jews as villains, reinforcing centuries-old stereotypes demonizing Jews. Gibson claimed he was just following the Gospels, but Dr. Friedrichsen doesn't buy that explanation.
He has Jesus being tortured after his arrest, where the Gospels say absolutely nothing about this. Jesus is hung upside down with chains, and he's in a prison and everything else, and it's this malevolent depiction of Jews being as bad as you could possibly imagine they were, and that's not in the Gospels. And also, Gibson, who is not enslaved to historical accuracy despite his marketing claims, has the temple destroyed by an earthquake at the very end of the movie as payback for the crucifixion of Jesus. So it's not a movie that's overly burdened with historical accuracy or fidelity to the Gospels, for that matter.
In today's political culture, we still see echoes of the old tropes from both sides of the aisle, like when Tucker Carlson compared Charlie Kirk's assassination to the murder of Jesus. Speaking to a giant crowd at Kirk's funeral, he reenacted his version of the crucifixion story from the perspective of the Jews.
We've got to shut this guy up. And I can just sort of picture the scene in a lamplit room with a bunch of guys sitting around eating hummus, thinking about what do we do about this guy telling the truth about us? We must make him stop talking. And there's always one guy with the bright idea, and I can just hear him say, I've got an idea, why don't we just kill him? That'll shut him up. That'll fix the problem.
Tucker may have thought he was being clever, but for many Jews listening, it was chilling. An arena of people mourning a politically charged assassination. It's the most dangerous place to revive the oldest anti-Semitic libel in history, especially when there were already baseless conspiracy theories accusing Israel of ordering the hit on Charlie Kirk.
You definitely had a motive. Let's be honest, Mr. Netanyahu.
And we've seen what happens when that ancient trope gets retold. Luckily, Tucker Carlson and Mel Gibson don't represent the mainstream Christian view. These days, many Christians see the depiction of the Jewish crowds in the Gospels not as an indictment of all Jews, but of all humanity. It happened to be Jewish crowds because they were in Judea. But it really represents the Christian idea that everyone shares responsibility for the crucifixion, not just one group of people. For centuries, Jesus' crucifixion has been twisted by some into a tale of collective guilt. It's been told in ways that turn neighbors into enemies, that turn sacred texts into blood libels. The enduring lesson here isn't just about the past. It's about never using faith to justify hatred. and never blaming an entire people for the actions of a few.